Michelle, while you were away, I moved my parents' stuff in.
Huh? What do you mean?
While I was on vacation, Bob, without permission, brought his parents' moving boxes into our home. To make matters worse, Bob did something unthinkable to me.
Don't come back.
Bob clearly didn't want me to return home. This house has always been our family home, but now Bob wants to live here with his parents and kick me out. However, having already anticipated being kicked out by Bob, I retorted nonchalantly. Alrighty then. Guess I'll move out on my own. Taking advice from my father, I took certain measures. Firstly, I emailed someone and had planned meticulously. I then returned to New York with my father. After getting back home, I acted according to the plan. Bob, who had been relaxed thinking he'd live comfortably with his parents, was taken aback by this unexpected turn of events. The plan I made with my father was: my name is Michelle Smith. I'm a 45-year-old nutritionist working in a hospital. I was supposed to take over my father's business, but inheriting my mother's love for cooking, I became a nutritionist. Unfortunately, my beloved mom passed away before I graduated from college. After that, my dad started working overseas, and I sold the family house and moved to an apartment. Ever since I was a child, being quite plain-looking, I went unnoticed wherever I went. On top of that, I went to an all-girls school from middle school through college, so I never really had the chance to meet men. Up until then, I never had a boyfriend. However, my friend, blessed to meet someone special somewhere, got married after we graduated from college. At her wedding, I met Bob, who is 3 years older than me and, by the looks of it, quite a catch. He was a friend of the groom and looked like the kind of guy who was popular with the ladies. Maybe I was just lucky, but it turned out he had just broken up with his girlfriend. His ex was a nurse, and they seemed to have broken up due to her night shifts and their mismatched schedules. When I mentioned I was a nutritionist and didn't have many early mornings or weekend duties, he seemed genuinely pleased. However, at that time, I was busy studying for my exam during my free days. Even with my busy schedule, he'd send sweet messages like, "I know it's hard not seeing each other, but keep up the good work studying." He was such a kind soul. Being around him, I felt a sense of destiny and began to think, once I pass, I want to marry him. Then came the day of the exam results. Upon learning I passed, he invited me out that night to celebrate, saying,
"Congratulations! Look! I want you to have this, if you'll accept it."
He handed me what was unmistakably an engagement ring. Right then and there, he proposed. Bob's happiness over my success, as if it were his own, left me so touched that I immediately said yes, tears in my eyes. And so, our married life began. At first, we thought of renting, but with some financial help from my dad, we bought our own home. I thought every day from then on would be filled with happiness, but that wasn't to be. After getting married, there was always something off about Bob when we were together. I assumed it was because I had no experience with men and thought I'd get used to it. However, one day, Bob looked at my payslip and made a comment that had me doubting my ears. "What's this? I thought nutritionists, being professionals and all, would earn more. This is all you make? Quite a letdown."
"Excuse me? I've just started working, and since we're both earning, isn't $5,000 a month from me just fine?"
His comment left a bad taste in my mouth. It's not that I got married to be supported, but having my salary criticized wasn't pleasant. To add insult to injury, Bob began to belittle my earnings further. Man, I feel duped. If I'd known you earned so little, I would have asked before we got married. A nurse would have surely earned more. With the mention of a nurse, I knew he was referencing his ex. Damn you, Bob. Complaining about my earnings is one thing, but comparing me to his ex was inexcusable. Certainly, as a nurse, there's the night shift differential and good pay for extra payments. Compared to that, since I have fewer early shifts and holiday work, it's understandable that my pay is lower. But I have my own complaints. I saw Bob's payslip recently, and it was even less than mine. Yet, I thought that combining both our incomes, we wouldn't struggle financially, so I said nothing. I tried to put it gently to not hurt Bob's pride.
Well, Bob, it seems like you have it tough too, so you were kind of hoping my payslip would be a bit more substantial, right? Sorry, I couldn't meet your expectations. Yeah. I work for a small business and make very little, so I was hoping for financial stability by marrying a professional woman like you.
I was just trying to cheer him up with some playful remarks, never expecting Bob to take it so seriously. Before we got married, he used to say he was glad that I had a regular working schedule. But now, it's like he's done a complete turnaround, complaining about my low income. I wonder where else in the world there are men who expect their wives to earn more than they do. I was simply astounded by Bob's lack of ambition. The moment he found out about my earnings, he began looking down on me. Yet, he can't resist buying what he wants immediately without any restraint. Even when I suggest we save a bit more, he doesn't want to hear it.
I've always gotten whatever I wanted from my parents since I was a kid. You can't just expect me to change my views on money overnight.
To Bob's childish remarks, I was at a loss for words. At his age, being spoiled by parents is hardly an excuse, isn't it? A year after our marriage, we were blessed with a baby boy. I hoped that becoming a father might change Bob, but his spending habits remained unchanged. He always spends his entire paycheck. If he's short, he sneaks into my wallet and takes money. While I was juggling work and raising our son, Kenny, Bob barely helped with the child rearing. Years flew by with us facing such challenges, and this year, Kenny is preparing for college admissions. With all the hard work in managing our finances, it seems we can just about manage to send him to college. Kenny, understanding our tight budget, said he'd try for a public university, studying day and night. Yet, Bob, his father, came up with an outrageous idea.
I bought a new car last year, so the loan payments are tough. Plus, Kenny's college admissions, right? So, I thought of selling my parents' house and having them move in with us. Hey! What are you talking about? We can't just suddenly start living with them. Why is that, Michelle? Our parents should get along with you, right? Living together would mean the pension money coming in, we'd be better off.
Indeed, I wasn't opposed to living with my in-laws. However, I just didn't like the way Bob would make decisions on his own. Financially speaking, as long as we don't splurge, we've managed well so far and there's no problem.
Why do you always decide things on your own, Bob? You bought that new car without consulting me at all. That's my car. I don't have to consult you about every little thing, do I?
Seeing Bob's selfish behavior, now Kenny was furious.
Dad, give it a break. When I go to college, I'll be coming home late from part-time or study. Having Grandma and Grandpa here would mean I'd have to be extra cautious. Why don't you ever discuss things properly with Mom?
Coming out of his room and suddenly raising his voice at Bob, Kenny's reaction took Bob by surprise. But the next moment, Bob turned his anger towards me, blaming me as if it was all my fault.
Kenny speaking back to me like that is because of your poor upbringing. Reflect on it.
Saying so, Bob went into the living room and didn't come out for a while. I was glad that Kenny stood up for me. However, I was concerned if this home environment would affect his exam preparations. Despite my worries, Kenny got into his top-choice state university. But having grown tired of being with his father, Kenny decided to move out and live on his own. He said he wanted to try and make it on his own, working without relying on his parents. Still, Bob pretended as if nothing was wrong with either me or Kenny. Since it became just Bob and me in the Smith house, we hardly speak even though we live under the same roof. It felt suffocating. During those challenging days, feeling mentally drained, I called my father overseas to seek advice. My father was worried about me and suggested I come to his place for a while. But I have a job and can't take too much time off. I thought so, but it turns out, my colleagues were concerned about my well-being as well. When I explained the situation, they agreed to let me take a break. However, I wanted to keep the consultation with my father a secret from Bob. So, I told him I was invited on a trip by a friend. I hoped that if I left the house for a while, Bob would cool down. With that in mind, I headed to my father's place, but an unexpected event occurred. It all started with a call from Bob while I was in my father's place.
Michelle, while you were away, I moved my parents' stuff in. Huh? What do you mean? I've told you before, haven't I? About living with my parents. Besides, Dad and Mom were pretty upset about you. They said a wife who spoils her son like that is the worst. You can't be serious.
I couldn't believe what Bob was saying. My in-laws shouldn't be the kind of folks who'd speak ill of me like that.
That's why, from now on, I've decided it'll be just the three of us, me and my parents, living in this house. If you were around, they'd feel like they'd have to walk on eggshells, especially since you've turned Kenny against me.
I suspected Bob might have exaggerated things when talking to my in-laws. Maybe the whole story about my in-laws being mad at me was also a fabrication. I was so mad, I wanted to shout back at him. But I kept my cool, told him I'd call him back later, and hung up. Luckily, my father was home at the time, so I immediately filled him in on the conversation. My father looked frustrated and ran his hands through his hair.
I really don't know what to say about Bob. Relying on his parents at his age. Exactly. I don't understand why I should be kicked out because of that.
After discussing for a while, my father made a suggestion. I felt elated, thinking this might put Bob in his place. I emailed someone first, then called Bob back on his cell.
Bob, I think we should sit down and talk when you're back from your trip.
I tried to sound calm, but Bob responded with a chuckle in his voice.
You're not coming back.
Following my dad's advice, Bob made it clear that he didn't want me to come home anymore. Having anticipated this, I quickly snapped back at him.
Alrighty then. Guess I'll move out on my own. Excuse me?
Perhaps taken aback by my unexpected response, Bob let out a voice of genuine surprise. But he seemed to think I was just bluffing, as he quickly laughed and retorted.
Where exactly are you planning on moving? You don't even have a place to go.
Oh, I'm already there.
What are you talking about? You're on a trip with friends. Wait, you're not with some guy, are you?
Now it seemed he was implying that I might be with another man, so I decided it was time to set the record straight.
A man?
Well, yes.
But it's just my dad. Oh, you're with your dad?
Bob sounded relieved. But he's in for another surprise.
My dad's currently living in a condo overseas, so I decided to stay with him. That's why we're gonna sell the house we lived in. What? What do you mean by that?
You knew, didn't you?
That house was built under my dad's name for us. If I'm not living there, he says he's gonna sell it. What? Mom and Dad are here right now. What are you thinking? That's what I was saying. We can't discuss this over the phone.
Bob, probably realizing the gravity of the situation, just hung up without saying another word. He probably can't imagine the drama that's awaiting him when I return to New York. A week later, my father and I returned to New York and arrived at the house where Bob was living with his parents. My in-laws greeted us with smiles at the entrance.
Oh, it's Michelle's father.
It's been a while.
Yes, indeed.
Due to work, I rarely get the chance to visit New York. I'm truly grateful for all the care you've shown, Michelle. As my father exchanged pleasantries, Bob sheepishly emerged from behind them. From his nervous demeanor, I gathered he hadn't told my in-laws about selling the house yet. All Bob did was bow his head in embarrassment.
Bob, the movers are coming to pick up our stuff today. Did you pack everything up?
Yeah,
I've packed all of your stuff. Oh? They're not just here for my things. What? My stuff needs to be out today too?
Bob's loud, surprised exclamation caught my father-in-law's attention. What's going on, Bob? Why are you moving your stuff too? Bob awkwardly looked towards my father-in-law and nervously began to explain the situation. Suddenly, my father-in-law became furious and began yelling at Bob.
You lied to me. I heard that this house was bought under your name with a loan. Thinking we could chip in, we decided to move in with you. You've embarrassed us. I won't forgive this.
Bob looked utterly defeated, as if he had been struck by lightning, by my father-in-law's booming voice. Just then, a moving company's truck arrived. After they finished moving my stuff out, my mother-in-law came out from the back of the house to handle the movers.
Thank you for your hard work. Our stuff is right here, so please go ahead and move it.
My mother-in-law had already neatly packed everything from around the house, including Bob's belongings. Bob was left in shock at my mother-in-law's actions.
Mom, what are you doing? Where are you planning to take even Dad's stuff?
Seeing Bob question my mother-in-law with wide eyes, all of us burst into laughter.
You got tricked, Bob. Huh? Why is everyone laughing all of a sudden?
Yes, actually, all of us present had previously planned to trick Bob. The first person I had contacted from overseas by email was my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law had always been concerned about the tired look on my face. Having been asked about it many times, I told my mother-in-law everything about Bob. Especially about how he blamed his extravagant behavior on being spoiled by his parents. At that story, my mother-in-law was shocked. And then, she broke down in tears in front of me, apologizing for the way she raised him, making me feel really awkward. But, the fact that Bob was wasting money wasn't really my mother-in-law's fault. While I tried to comfort her, saying so, the bond between my mother-in-law and me deepened. And now, for me, who didn't have a mother, my mother-in-law had truly become someone I could confide in about anything. My father knew well about my close relationship with my mother-in-law. So, for this plan, I had asked my father to get my in-laws' help. And, without Bob finding out, my mother-in-law consulted with my father-in-law and found a new place for them to live. In fact, the earlier scene where my father-in-law yelled at Bob was all an act. It was such a great performance that I almost burst into laughter in the middle.
Thank you for arranging the movers for my stuff as well. Now, I can move to the house my father built overseas.
No, thank you.
I'm really sorry. Because I raised such a son, I've only caused trouble for you, Michelle.
Wasn't that an unspoken agreement between us? My mother-in-law and I shared a laugh over that comment. Bob seemed taken aback. He had no idea I was so close with my in-laws. His face was a picture of confusion.
Mom, where are we gonna move to now? We already sold our old family home.
We already arranged a new place for us. Bob looked relieved to hear that. But his sense of relief would likely be short-lived, as he'd soon find out.
Oh, so that's settled then. I was worried for nothing. So, I just move in with you guys?
What are you talking about? It's a senior living community for your father and me. You're not a kid anymore, Bob. You need to find your own place. As soon as my mother-in-law said that, Bob's face turned completely pale.
I can't do that. I don't even have the money to move, let alone find a new place.
The truth was, Bob had been wasting all his earnings on hobbies and entertainment, leaving him with no savings. There was no one to blame but himself. In his desperation, he looked at me with pleading eyes. I had a good idea of what he was about to ask.
Speaking of which, Michelle, doesn't your dad own a pretty big house overseas? I had no idea you came from such a wealthy background. Come on, I'll do whatever you say from now on. Can't you take me to live with you there?
He suddenly changed his tone, trying to butter me up. I wasn't buying any of it and responded firmly.
I've been deceived by your sweet words too many times before. You've been unreliable, never contributing enough for our living expenses, and always out having fun. I don't want to be married to you anymore. I talked to Kenny on the phone yesterday, and we both agree that divorce is the best option.
I had finally let out everything that had been weighing on my mind. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. My in-laws seemed to agree, nodding gravely.
Oh man, what am I gonna do now?
Bob lamented, tears filling his eyes. But my mind was made up. I handed him the divorce lawyer's contact and papers I had prepared earlier, asking for his signature. But Bob was stubborn and refused it. Seeing this, my father-in-law's face turned stern.
Bob, it's about time you face reality. You've put Michelle through enough. And now you're trying to rely on her family's wealth? I'm ashamed to call you my son. That's right, I know we've pampered you, but you're a grown man now. You can't always get your way. You need to stand on your own 2 feet.
Faced with this earnest plea from his parents, big tears rolled down Bob's cheeks.
What's the deal? Even Dad and Mom? Is there no one on my side here?
Bob mumbled to himself as he agreed to discuss further through the lawyer. He then finished storing his belongings in the storage unit and left the house alone. Feeling betrayed by his parents whom he thought were his allies, he seemed deeply hurt. However, my in-laws had made up their minds to sever ties with Bob. It wasn't just my in-laws, though. I too had promised Bob that I would never let him see Kenny again. That's because Kenny had been adamant about it. Ever since he was a child, Kenny had despised Bob, who had never acted much like a father. So, when we decided to divorce, Kenny told me he wanted to cut ties with his father too. I believed it was for the best for Kenny. After being abandoned by his parents and disowned by his son, perhaps Bob lost the will to live. Having lost everything, Bob spent some time living in motels. But after he got paid, it seems he managed to move to a small apartment. During the divorce, I did give Bob some money as part of our shared assets. Technically, he didn't really deserve much, but I was well off and gave him some money to avoid any financial disputes later on. In other words, it was sort of a severance pay. However, as soon as Bob had a little financial stability, he seemed to get into singles mixers and city social events. Why do I know this? Because Bob messaged me saying, "Gonna find a well-off woman and show me up." In the beginning, right after being alone, Bob would just message saying he was lonely. But once he had money, his attitude changed. Time passed, and suddenly, I stopped hearing from Bob. I thought he might have found a new girlfriend, but it seems the situation was far more severe. According to my former in-laws, it appears Bob fell head over heels for a nurse he met at one of the mixers. However, despite her not being interested at all, Bob kept pursuing her relentlessly. At its worst, he even showed up at her apartment unannounced. As a result of his persistent stalking, she reported him and he was arrested on the spot. They thought they had finally severed ties with their son, were now overwhelmed with his mess, which was truly unfortunate. Being a parent is tough. No matter how much you want to let go, you're still responsible when things go south. Despite causing so much trouble for his parents, Bob still hasn't learned his lesson. Throughout the interrogation, he kept insisting it was true love. As a result, it seems he's deemed unrepentant and isn't getting released anytime soon. Well, maybe it's best for a guy like that to cool his heels in prison for a while. It's one thing when you're young, but a penniless man nearing 50 clinging to such ideals is just gonna be a nuisance. And now, I'm living a luxurious life in a condo with my father. I'm still getting used to this new environment, so I'm not working yet. However, I can't be without a job forever, so I'm attending a local conversation classes. Once I get a good grasp of the language, I plan to help out at my father's company. Time flew by and Kenny graduated from college. He moved to here around the same time and started working at my father's company. Turns out, my father always intended to have Kenny as his successor and had invited him here. I missed Kenny so much these past 4 years, but now we can live together forever. Thinking of this makes me so happy. Now, having become fairly familiar with the place, I assist my father at his company and also work as an instructor at a local American cooking class on the side. Since it's a unique class, now a bit famous in the area, so I have lots of students. Being one of the few American instructors here, I'm quite popular among my students. Even though my marriage didn't work out, my life here is very fulfilling now. Even though I'm in my mid-40s, I'd say I'm in the perfect environment to enjoy life to the fullest. I've decided to forget about my past where I was plain and not very popular, and to live life positively from now on. After all, I have a long way to go. I'm sure my mother in heaven is watching over me.